ARTURIA just released the AudioFuse 16Rig and they are calling it a high-density audio centerpiece, which I think is a pretty good description, and you'll understand why when you see the interface. Hey, Julian Kraus here, and with me I got the AudioFuse 16Rig, which is ARTURIA's latest flagship audio interface. In this video we're going to have a look at the hardware, check out the audio quality with some measurements, and also talk about the pros and cons of this interface. Before we dive in, quick disclaimer: ARTURIA sent me the 16Rig in return for an honest review. All measurements and opinions in this video are my own, and ARTURIA has no say in the making of this video. They don't even get to see the video before it goes live. Alright, let's check out the hardware and then dive into the audio quality before wrapping up with a look at the software. The interface is primarily designed to be put into a rack with its standardized form factor, and you also get the corresponding mounting hardware. But you can also use the mounting brackets as standing feet, and then you can put the interface on a desk, which is the setup that I'm using here. Starting on the front, you get easy access to a pair of 1/4-inch outputs, which have a nice trick up their sleeves, because you can either set them up as normal line level outputs, but also direct through connections from input 1 and 2, use them as additional headphone outputs, and you can also use them as reamp outputs. Further to the right, you get 2 XLR and TRS combo inputs, accepting mic, line and instrument signals. Quite interestingly, if you want to quickly route a stereo signal into the interface from, for example, a phone, you can easily do that with the 3.5mm connection on the front. For channel 3 and 4, you can either use the 3.5mm connection or the connections on the back, which I'll get to in a second. In the middle, you get several buttons which quickly let you navigate between different pages in order to, for example, control in and outputs and also monitor audio levels. Further navigation is done with a decoder knob, and all the information is displayed on a built-in display. I really like that the navigation is so responsive. You can easily browse through all the settings, and the display gives you tons of information, which on the one hand can be quite nice, but I have to admit it is sometimes a bit cramped and you have to get quite close to the display to see what's going on. There is a reason for that though. ARTURIA wanted to make as many features of the 16Rig available via the onboard controls, and because of that the interface can be used as a standalone device to mix and route audio without any PC connected. 2 small points of critique: I sometimes find it a bit hard to see when a channel is clipping, as there's just a very small indicator for this, and I personally like a channel to jump out at me when it is clipping. And there's no indicator light for phantom power. You have to go into each mic submenu to check if phantom power is on. Would be great if you get an indicator on the input screen, and that might be something ARTURIA can add via a software update. Further to the right, you get your 4 monitoring controls. Here you can mute the audio, control the main output volume, and have another custom button, which can for example be used for A/B monitor switching. The 16Rig also provides 2 headphone connections, one 3.5mm and a 1/4-inch connection, which both output the same mix. You can use them at the same time with 2 separate headphones, but they only have 1 volume dial for both of them. One thing I don't fully understand is why the volume control for the headphone output can only be controlled with the dial on the interface. ARTURIA told me that they wanted to make it a hardware control to avoid the risk of sudden volume changes, but you can control pretty much any other function via the software, including the volume of the alternative headphone outputs, but not the main ones. Why? So yeah, it's a bit of a missed opportunity in my opinion, because the dial is also quite close to the headphone port and you tend to get your finger stuck between the volume dial and the headphone jack. Continuing with more positive things, in typical ARTURIA fashion, you also get some I/O for synthesizers. You get a USB connection, which specifically is used as a USB MIDI connection, and one more USB input, which simply acts as a USB hub. Switching to the back, you find a boatload of in and outputs, both digital and analog. On the analog side, you get 16 TRS line level inputs, but I guess you already expected this from a device called 16Rig. On the main output side, you get a set of main monitor outputs and another 8 balanced outputs, which are also DC coupled, and that way they can be used to send control voltage signals to outboard gear, and once again increasing the feature set of the 16Rig in the synthesizer department. You could theoretically also realize a full Atmos 7.1.4 setup if you wanted to. The 16Rig is also expandable via ADAT with another set of 16 in and 16 outputs. Again, the name 16Rig makes sense. Just one thing to add is that the amounts of channels you have available depends quite a bit on the set sample rate. For example, you can only use all 16 analog inputs, when you use a sample rate of 96 kHz and below. Otherwise you can only use 8 channels. Similar thing on the ADAT connection. With 192 kHz you actually don't have any ADAT connections available. Only with 96 kHz you get additional 8 in and outputs, and with 48 kHz or lower you can use the full 16 additional input and output channels. I personally don't think this is an issue, but be aware that the number of channels you have available simply depends on the set sample rate. To keep everything in sync, you get 2 additional BNC connections for either word clock in or output. No MIDI connections though, if you were hoping to see something like this. In terms of MIDI connections, the 16Rig again offers more than most interfaces, 1 MIDI input and 2 either out or through connections. And for you hardcore synthesizer aficionados, there's also a 3.5mm connection providing an analog MIDI clock pulse. There is another USB hub connection, a USB-C connection, which is used to connect the interface to the PC, with the quite fancy looking and included USB-C to C and USB-C to Type-A cable. And lastly, the interface is powered with the included power supply, which is needed for the interface to turn on. This is connected with a locking connection, which is a great idea on an interface like the 16Rig. Of course, I was way too curious and had to take apart the interface, and I gotta say, the build quality is really nice. The housing is completely out of metal, and it looks like the interface is comprised out of multiple modules, which can make it easier to fix if ever something were to break. And do I see genuine Omron relays and WEMA caps here? Nice. After assembly, put 2 lines of glue on the outside of TR1. Yep, can confirm, glue is there. For the analog to digital conversion, the 16Rig uses a CS43198 for the main output, and an ESS ES9080Q for the DC coupled outputs. The headphones are driven with an ES9010K2M. On the analog to digital side, the conversion is done with 4 ESS ES9842Q Pros. These are all excellent converters, and Arturia definitely has not skimped here. Alright, time to check out the audio quality. The frequency response of the mic input is really flat in the audible range, and that's even at the maximum gain setting, which is the worst case scenario. At a lower gain setting, which is often used with condenser microphones, the response is pretty much a flat line, and this is crucial for an uncolored sound. Distortion-wise, the input also performs excellently with a typical mic level. There is not even a hint of distortion visible here, as this is a constantly descending line. If I increase the signal level, only then we get to see some distortion components where the graph levels out. But this is 110 dB below the test signal and certainly inaudible. Next up is preamp noise. Especially for dynamic microphones, you want the preamp to add as little noise as possible when amplifying low-level signals from the mic. And before I tell you my measurement results, I want to let you listen to the noise floor of a worst case scenario. As you can see, I have a Shure SM7B connected directly to the interface. This mic outputs an incredibly low signal level, which accentuates preamp noise. I'll be quiet for a second to let you listen to the noise floor of this setup. That's very low noise even for the SM7B, and that's exactly what we see in my measurements as well. Here the 16Rig comes in with a value of about -130 dB UA weighted, and that puts it in the excellent category with the other top performers. Have a listen of what kind of difference this makes between a few interfaces. To be honest, I really like to see this performance level, as for some reason even more expensive interfaces seem to not bother as much with preamp noise. But if you buy a premium interface, you absolutely want it to perform well in all aspects, and the 16Rig does not disappoint. That of course also means that there's no need for a cloud-fed header or any other inline preamp. You really don't gain anything from them in terms of noise performance. And quite frankly, the amount of gain that the 16Rig provides on its own is also great, so no need for any external amplification. That said, you can of course connect additional mic preamps if you like via the many line level inputs. And people who use outboard gear like audio processors, synths and drum machines will be pleased to hear that the performance of the line level inputs is very well indeed. The frequency response is virtually a flat line across the chart, and it stays that way even with the pad engaged, which is great to see. Distortions are once again inaudible, sitting easily 105 dB below the test signal. That's really clean. The 16Rig continues its great performance with an excellent amount of dynamic range. With 117.5 dB, it sits happily within a couple of dBs of the top performers, and I'm not counting the UAC 232 here, as it is kinda cheating with its dual ADC configuration. Anyways, with such a high dynamic range, it is pretty much unlikely that you will ever encounter any situation where you need more. Now, after these raving numbers, I have to bring something up that I'm not quite sure how I feel about yet. DC offset. A small amount of DC offset is present on the analog inputs of the 16Rig. This essentially slightly biases the signal away from -infinity. DC offset can be problematic for multiple reasons, like clicking noises when cutting between tracks, loss of headroom, or premature distortion. Now, to be fair, I did not observe any of these issues with the 16Rig, most likely because the DC offset is very small in each channel. But I do see a potential risk when mixing together multiple channels, because their DC offset can stack. If you mix together all 16 inputs of the 16Rig, the DC offset rises to above -60 dBFS. And if you use compression and amplification in post, then this will be amplified even more. Again, this might not lead to audible problems, but in unfortunate circumstances, this might have negative side effects as described before. Luckily, DC offset is easy to remove in any DAW, sometimes even with a single click of a button. But I think for an interface in this price range, this simply shouldn't be something you have to worry about. I did talk to ARTURIA about this, and they are looking into building a calibration method which should reduce DC offset. This feature is not available at the time of this review, but I will check it out if it becomes available. Have a look in the comments, as I will keep you posted there. On a more positive side note about DC voltages, the 8-line outputs are DC coupled, and this is a good thing, as you can use the outputs to send signals to control voltage-driven audio gear. As far as I'm aware, there are not many interfaces out there with DC coupled outputs, as this is typically not needed for normal audio playback. But if you are into control voltage gear, I think it's great to have this many DC coupled outputs, providing plus and minus 8.7 volt DC from tip to sleeve. Frequency response again is ruler flat. I don't think I need to say anything about this. That's pretty much perfect. Dynamic range-wise, the monitor output performs extremely well with 126.4 dB, which puts the 16Rig in second place in this test. The DC coupled outputs are slightly lower though, around 121 dBA. Oh no, the DC coupled outputs have a slightly higher amount of inaudible noise. I don't think I have to say anything about that. That's an excellent performance. I wanted to show you the distortion versus amplitude graph as I usually do, but the 16Rig outperforms my audio analyzer, so that wasn't going to happen. I have different means of measuring the distortion performance though, and you can see here that all distortion components sit happily below -120 decibels compared to the test signal. We don't even have to argue, this is completely inaudible. Yeah, I would deem the outputs to be sonically transparent, meaning that you only hear the played back audio from these outputs without any noise and distortion. Besides that, the 16Rig is also one of the few interfaces that outputs proper professional line level with a maximum output of around 20 dBV. Stellar performance. Alright, headphone output performance time, and as always I've put the 16Rig in my table, which is definitely a bit cluttered at this point, but it allows you to compare it directly to other interfaces. If we have a look at just the 16Rig, you can see that there are 2 rows here, and that's because the performance between the main headphone output and the alt phone outputs are slightly different. In terms of frequency response, the main headphone output and alt phone output are very similar, being nearly completely flat in the audible range. No complaints here. Where they do differ though is in the output impedance, which should be very low to not have an impact on the sound. Here the main connection comes in around 5 ohms, which is quite alright, while the alt phone connections have about 33 ohms. It's not the end of the world, but with low impedance headphones there's a pretty good chance that this might impact the sound. If accuracy is important for you, I would advise to use headphones with at least 80 ohms or above with the alt phone connections. Power is also slightly different between the main and alt phone outputs. The main outs have noticeably more output and can drive pretty much any common studio headphone to a loud listening level. And while the alt phone connection has less output, in practice it should still be enough for most cases. One thing I want to mention is that the 16Rig has 3 different settings to set the level for headphones above 150 ohm, 50 to 150 and below 50 ohms. This setting only affects the amount of power the interface outputs and has no further impact on the sound quality. So all measurements here have been made with the greater than 150 ohm setting for the maximum power output. Distortion performance is really great with higher impedance headphones, although with low impedance headphones the distortion rises quite a bit. In practice this is really not noticeable, but I would have liked to see a slightly better technical performance here. This also goes for noise performance. Here I was a bit surprised because much cheaper interfaces outperform the 16Rig in this aspect. And I have to say, with IEMs I could definitely hear an underlying noise floor. Granted, not many people are using IEMs in a music studio, and with over-ear headphones it is likely that you will not hear any noise from the output. Still, it could have been better. All in all, a decent headphone output with quite a bit of power, but a slight shortcoming in terms of noise performance. Okay, let's have a look at the software, which provides quite a variety of features. I'm not going to go through every single functionality, otherwise we would be here all day. So I'll just give you a brief preview and my thoughts. First thing I want to mention is that I had to install the driver, otherwise the interface was not recognized by my Windows PC. Just FYI. At the very top you can find the UI scaling options, which I personally really like, as sometimes the fonts can be really tiny on 4K screens, but that's not the case here. And I think it's great to have easy access to the manual as well, as the 16Rig does have so many features, it's sometimes easy to lose track and then the manual can bring you back up to speed. On the far right you get your basic settings. This includes clock settings and monitoring preferences, including the setup of A/B monitoring. You get some more customizability in the Preferences tab, and the firmware update page obviously lets you see the firmware and update it. Besides that, the software also lets you save your whole configuration, which makes it easy to switch between different setups with just a few clicks. The main part of the software is segregated into 5 sections: I/O settings page, main mix page, Q mix page, routing matrix, and MIDI section. On the I/O page you have a full overview over all your analog and ADAT in and outputs, and have control over things like enabling pad, phase inversion, turning on and off phantom power, setting your output volume, changing output 3 and 4 to different operating modes, yada yada yada. Tons of stuff. By the way, here's what you can see with a sample rate of 96 kHz and 192 kHz. As mentioned in the beginning, with higher sample rates the channel count is reduced and then they are grayed out in the software. On the main mix page you get to create a fully custom mix, and on the right side you get the controls over 4 aux channels and the master fader. You can add a seemingly endless number of inputs to the mix, and for each channel you have aux sense, pan and volume controls. The Q page is pretty much identical to the main mix page, with the only difference that there are no aux sense here. And you can turn the Q mix on and off with the Q button. The routing matrix gives you the option to route any source to pretty much any destination. Important point here is that sources can be connected to multiple destinations, but not the other way around. And just mentioning it here, the routing matrix is not accessible in the standalone mode. The routing of the 16Rig is of course done digitally, and that means that it will have some amount of latency, which also depends on the set sample rate. That said, I'm happy to report that the latency is ultra low and not perceptible. It even stays the same regardless if the signal is running through the main mix, is used for direct monitoring, or routed via the routing matrix. And the latency stays at an imperceptible level even with the interface in standalone mode. Lastly, let's jump to the MIDI page, and here I can only click around a bit for you to see the options, as I have to confess I'm by no means a MIDI expert. But I want to highlight one feature which I thought was quite interesting. The main mixer is actually controllable via MIDI itself, so you can use MIDI hardware to control the main mix, which might be the preferred way of some people to interact with the main mixer instead of using the software. With all of this, I'm just scratching the surface here, and if you want to know more about the features of the 16Rig, I highly recommend to have a look at the manual, because there's a detailed description of all the features of the interface. Now, in my time using the software, I did have a few rare hiccups. One time, for example, I could raise the gain on one channel, but I couldn't lower it again. Or one time I connected the interface and the software stated that there's no interface detected. Luckily, this was all very easily fixed. Either interestingly, it just worked a second later when I tried again, or after a quick restart of the software, everything was always back in working order. So while these incidents weren't game-breaking, I'm still hoping that there are some improvements in terms of stability. And ARTURIA actually already mentioned that they have made some improvements in the software. In terms of round-trip latency, that's when the recorded signal is sent to the PC and then played back again by the interface, The 16Rig fared alright, though comparatively speaking the numbers are on a slightly longer side. The performance is quite consistent though, regardless of the used sample rate, and I noticed that you can disable the save mode in the driver, which shaves off about 2 more milliseconds at an increased risk of crackling audio. Alright, let's close out the video and I'll start with the things to consider before buying the 16Rig. First of all, there is no internal audio processing present, so no EQ, compression, reverb or anything the like. The 16Rig only has 2 mic inputs, so if you want to connect more microphones, then you need an additional preamp. As mentioned in the beginning, there are some limitations in terms of number of channels that you can use with a given sample rate, and you only have all of them available with either 48 or 44.1 kHz. And lastly, I have mentioned DC offset on the inputs before. Check the comments to see if there are any updates on this, which might eliminate this topic in the future. On the plus side, I have to say the 16Rig provides an excellent audio quality through and through. The inputs are exceptionally clean with high dynamic range and inaudible amounts of distortion and ultra low noise preamps. The output side is also really nice, the headphone output performance is great and the line outputs on the back are transparent, meaning there's no chance you will hear any noise or distortion from them. Additionally, 8 outputs are DC coupled and can be used to send signals to control voltage devices. The routing and mixing functionality of the 16Rig is also quite sophisticated with main and Q mix, aux sense and a full routing matrix. Nearly all the functionality is controllable via the software and simultaneously also on the device itself, so the 16Rig can be used as a standalone device. And there are some more quality of life features like easy reamping with the outputs on the front, saving and loading common mix and routing configurations, and the MIDI controllable MIDI mixer. If you're looking for an interface with ample I/O, additional expandability and elaborate mixing and routing functionality, the 16Rig could be what you're looking for. And if you regularly work with synths, drum machines and sequencers, then I think the AudioFuse 16Rig becomes especially interesting. Okay, that's it for now. If that was useful to you, please give me a thumbs up and subscribe if you didn't already do so. I will see you all in the next one.